when Jeff and the chairs were sort of formulating the theme for the conference, the sort of the idea of post-human frontiers, and the kind of all of the issues and overlaps and things that engages and has interplays with, the first person that came to my mind was Theo Spyropoulos. And if you don't know Theo, Theo's he's a young architect, educator, thinker, youngish, I guess now, and the breadth of the work, the kind of things that he's getting into, I'd actually call the work very promiscuous on a certain level. I think he's really flirting with lots of different things, and putting together incredible sort of combinations. Theo is currently the director of the Architectural Association DRL, the Design Research Lab, which is really a kind of world-renowned lab based in London. Many of the DRL graduates are part of the ACADIA community. In fact, even today and actually throughout the next two or 3 days, we'll see papers and projects from folks that have emerged from that community, including Jose Sanchez this morning, folks like Alvin Huang, and a whole bunch of other people I don't have time to kind of mention. Let's just say that the work of the DRL has been incredibly influential. The work and the research and the pedagogy, let's say, have been in a way trailblazing. And I think Theo has really been at the kind of the heart of that with his other kind of DRL conspirators or collaborators, I guess you'd call them. And certainly the work of that program resonates with this community. Certainly what you saw this morning and what you're going to see this afternoon and for the rest of the few days, a lot of those kernels I think are sort of being propagated at the DRL. So in addition to being an educator and being at the heart of this program at the AA, Theo is also the director with his brother Stephen of Minimaforms, a design practice based in London. Another sort of extraordinary part of Theo's life, let's say. And their work, which I think Theo will show, is in the permanent collections of places like FRAC and the Archigram Archive. We've seen his work recently at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Detroit Institute of Arts, ICA, FRAC, and a bunch of other things. We've also recently seen Theo's work published in places like Wired and Fast Company, Guardian, Blueprint, Icon, and the list kind of goes on and on. So we're really privileged to have this extraordinary designer, educator, and kind of thinker here. And please welcome Theodore Spyropoulos.
I think Jason's introduction was a bit too kind. My name's Theodore Spyropoulos, and as Jason said, I've been wrestling with the idea of computation, about design, about thinking about facilitating new forms of communication now for quite some time. I'm not that young as Jason wants to make me out to be. Part of that conversation has evolved very much, I think, in parallel between my time in London at the AA and sorry, can I click through this or this? I have to. Do I take this down basically? Sorry, trying to see how I could launch my thing. Sorry. So going back into it. In between my time at the AA, which I moved back to London in 2002 with my brother Stephen, and a studio that we set up called Minimaforms, which was really a framework really to explore ideas of communication, interaction, and to shift, I think, from models of representation towards things that are prototypical. I titled the talk for today, All is Behavior, and it's basically a play on a statement, a provocation that Hans Hollein gave to the discipline where he said everything was architecture, all is architecture. He said a true architecture of our time will have to redefine itself and expand its means. Many areas outside of the traditional building will enter the realm of architecture as architecture and architects will have to enter new realms, new fields. All are architects, everything is architecture. At the AA, to be honest with you, since the 50s till now, there's been a kind of spirited kind of idea that ideas are really at the heart of where we start to move forward as a trajectory, discursively, through practice, by interrogating new ways of asking questions. James Gowan wrote a book as a kind of overview, which he titled it A Continuous Experiment, and I think in many ways, I think that this is part of the larger kind of approach and attitude that I have with my colleagues, that architecture is really a shared and collective act. This is a photograph of John Fraser and Cedric Price, Gordon Pask, students of the AA working together, and some of those ideas germinating into things like the Fun Palace. At the same time, you could consider things like the Osaka Expo as an opportunity of prototyping ideas and putting it out into the world. For me, it's very important to make things accessible and to make them shared. But convening together, I think, also has a certain responsibility. In Osaka, for example, you had characters like Yona Friedman and Moshe Safdie, Dennis Crompton from Archigram, and others who are coming together almost for the first time, meeting in a space as a kind of form of interface to discuss the ideas of architecture, the status of where things were, and basically the projection of where they could be. And I think in the community, if this is a community, I think that this is an opportunity in the same regard. So at the heart of a lot of the things that I try to do with my brother in Minimaforms and my colleagues of Minimaforms and at the DRL is to try to make things accessible, shared, and I would argue collective. A lot of the work that we develop in Minimaforms also tries to see through technology the humanity of things. A lot of the things that we start to talk about, a lot of the things that we try to desire to work through is not computation for computational sake or digital design. We talk about design as a mode of inquiry. How can we ask questions about things? How can design, in a certain way I could argue, is, because I'm very unapologetic about it, actually permeates all aspects of our life. And part of the obligation of a designer, I think, is to work through some of those things, to upgrade the kind of conversation and also the idea of practice and what that actually entails. So I'm very much about celebrating diversity and trying to develop frameworks that enables other people to sort of participate, and in a way through participation sort of construct an understanding for themselves. I'll talk a little bit in terms of the framework for this conversation. I'm going to give a little bit of a background of some of the references which I think are very fundamental to us. And at the same time, I'll share 3 projects with you. One of them was called Memory Cloud that we performed in Detroit outside of the DIA. But if it's from robotics to atmospheres, to be honest with you, I don't privilege a style or a certain kind of attitude of design, which is singular. I feel that architecture and projects make demands and they sort of exhibit their own sort of tendencies and pursuits, and in a certain way, you actually work through those things. When it comes to a certain argument for the conversation today, we're going to speak about robotics over the next 3 days, but I think what's interesting is if you look at people like Rodney Brooks, some time ago in '97, he said it's going to be harder to distinguish what is alive and what is machine. The boundary may become meaningless. And just as certain things become meaningless, also certain definitions about how we describe things start to lose their clarity and meaning. This is maybe most evident in the conceptual work of someone like Joseph Kosuth, who basically wrote 1-3 chairs as a kind of conceptual project. The image of a chair, the object itself, or its definition, all basically constitute the definition of what a chair is. But at the end of the day, what happens actually when we live in a world when even our objects have agency? If I could find my mouse. What happens when we live in a time actually when actually chairs themselves have their own behaviors? Like all of the smart things that we try to explore these days with our interfaces, our phones, things themselves actually have information, have the capacity to understand themselves holistically in some form. And in a certain way, we open up a conversation in terms of how can we actively participate in this. This is the work of Raffaello Di Andrea. In the spirit of Kosuth, this would be a thought experiment, I think, for him. When we look in the news, we see the conversations of these things emerging in different ways. The shock value of what we talk about in terms of technology or future has become so everyday that it actually loses its sort of ability to shock. Future of tech, robots and designers, this isn't CNN money. If we look at roboticists like, for example, Hiroshi Ishiguro, you see him basically next to, you see him standing next to an image of himself, but it's not an image as a construction of himself, but it's a behavioral kind of creature in its own right that tries to learn from himself, tries to exhibit things. They are the same, but actually radically different. And a certain way of thinking about what motivates these kind of things, I think, is really fundamental, because if we don't sort of interrogate some of the conversation inherently about where we sit and see technology as something other than us, you get into this kind of conundrum. This is Lee Sedol, who was basically playing Go against AlphaGo, and saw his pursuit of actually beating the computer as something that actually was burdened with the idea of humanity versus the machine. He lost the first time and he felt that it was just because of stress. He lost the second time. He lost the third time and he felt that he was a public, how can I say, letdown for all the people, because in some way the machine had conquered him in this kind of intellectual foray of the games that we play. But the reality is, the back end of all of those developments, thousands of people have been working, understanding, trying to build systems that engage this. And at the end of the day, if we don't ask better questions about this, we're left in this kind of very black and white definition. I mentioned that everyday objects actually have agency. They have their capacity to see the world in their own way. This is two kind of hoovers or vacuum cleaners, like the Roomba on the left and a Chinese knockoff on the right, that basically come out when you're leaving your apartment and they start to map the world and basically deal with certain tasks. When we talk about machine learning and we talk about all these other things, we see this kind of new space. It's not a top-down space or a bottom-up space. It's real-time. It's evolving. It's something that deals or has to deal with uncertainty, and we see that a lot in the autonomous car struggles that people are having at the moment. And some of the work that we do at the DRL with my students, we try to explore some of those questions, but also start to fundamentally ask ourselves, well, if we did have these autonomous cars, what other challenges do we have? So for example, this was a proposal to think about the car as a self-assembly kind of unit itself and use parking, which is a challenge in London and everywhere, as an ability of using this mono wheel to basically evolve a kind of temporary structure that could be deployed within the city, looking at a kind of distribution strategy that would allow these things to evolve over time. We build prototypes, and our students, to be honest with you, are not roboticists. They're not scripters or coders. They come to us as a group of people that are motivated with a desire to try to explore ideas. And exploring ideas sort of leads you down a path which, to be honest with you, is uncertain, but at the heart of it is always inspirational as you start to discover instead of trying to just project, let's say, an assumption that you may have in the world. And this desire is not something that we obviously are the ones doing. This is a desire that I think is fundamentally at the heart of innovation and discovery. This is Walter Gray Walter, who designed one of the first autonomous machines in 1950. This were called the tortoises. And you see that he purposefully photographed that with his family in a certain way to show that these domestic relationships were not something other, and it's not science fiction. We're living in science fact. When you see situations of some of the work, sorry for my Jersey cursing. You see some of the work being done at ETH. This is a work of D'Andrea again, exploring quadrocopters, and in a certain way it may be a technical exercise of showing the dexterity of how one machine can be. So this juggling exercise going back and forth may seem like play, but at the same time you realize that these machines don't need us anymore. And if you see in this last year, there's the Drone Olympics, which actually has a challenge of multi-million dollars worth of prize money, which was won by a 14-year-old kid. The history of computation, I think, has always been the history of exploring ideas and actually not coming at them with a very particular attitude, but actually with a general interest of what if. So the Architecture Machine Group has been mentioned today, and Negroponte had just graduated, set up a lab, let's call it a 10-year experiment, and that migrated into something that we know as the Media Lab today, which obviously was part of that communication revolution. In London, at the same time, we had people like Cedric Price, who basically said technology is the answer. But he followed that up with what was a question. And as we sort of explore computation, we've also recognized in the last maybe 15, 20 years that that means actually something very different to very different characters. What's generative, what's behavioral, what's parametric, what's analog. But as we start to sort of evolve this kind of digital analog discussion, as we start to see how algorithms potentially could start to offer different ways, different solution spaces for fundamentally thinking about how we do things, you can see these kind of, one of the most simplest kind of machine learning kind of scripts here, trying to depict the Mona Lisa, and at the same time, you can see it actually just trying to negotiate the space like Super Mario Brothers. This idea of sort of evolving iterations is also not the kind of mindless exercise of just generating things without criteria. We try to generate a certain attitude of fitness, try to understand actually what are the behavioral traits, and on the one hand, that sort of exhibits itself in certain forms digitally, but then it also migrates into this world of materiality where this as well has lifelike characteristics and goes through phase changes and have life cycles. So as we start to really try to discover and unopen and unpack these kind of ideas, we're sort of giving ourselves over, I think, to a kind of new way of thinking about design, in a much more conversational way, the way that we speak through the prototypes and the way that these prototypes actually speak back to us. A lot of the work that I've been developing in the studio at the DRL with my students and colleagues have been looking at ways of making architecture autonomous. This is very different from the project of autonomy and all of these other kind of discursive sort of approaches to discourse at the moment. This is about thinking about how could we develop architectural frameworks or systems that have the capacity to be self-aware, that have the capacity to be mobile, to self-structure, to self-assemble. How can we design things in a way that we can explore these kind of component-like strategies, but without the kind of dogma of the discreteness of the thing itself being always the thing itself. Seeing about, almost like in nature, this idea of bodybuilding and taxonomies evolve over time, and with that, fundamentally asking the question, how do things actually really adapt? How do we deal with uncertainty? How do we deal with these kind of things? It's one thing to simulate those worlds. It's another thing to sort of try to find within the limits that we have in the studio. We're not funded in terms of grant money. We don't basically have a lot of companies like pushing down our door, basically trying to give us seed money to develop this kind of work. But what we do have is, I think, this kind of very spirited kind of approach towards trying to make and to try to discover, to shift from representation to the prototypical. Some of the work that you could see in the last couple of years has really dealt with an idea of agency and high population systems, but with this concept that robotics could be facilitated in a way to create an architecture that's not fixed and finite, but that is something that's dynamic and evolving. And the way that we work on these things, I think, fundamentally are more about demonstrating a proof of concept than to believe that these things are robots that are ready to be let loose in the world. I think as you work on these things, there's a great humility that you have and respect for people that have the capacity to actually work through some of these problems. But I actually really don't believe in disciplinary boundaries. I feel that, to be honest with you, a question of robotics, a question of space or interface or scripting is all a design question, and it could be explored by people working together collectively to sort of develop strategies of how this could be. This is a project called Hypercell, for example. What is it? A structure that is actually completely swarm-like and agile, has its own agency, has its own capacity to understand the limits of its own body plan, and to collaborate and construct kind of shared kind of models of mobility and structuring that would allow this to evolve. Some of them are working through mechanical sort of ideas of actuation. Some of them are looking towards soft robotics. At the heart of all of these things is trying to work through a certain kind of hybridity that allows these things really a chance to be motivated and to kind of explore things. So space jamming, for example, silicone kind of studies that we're developing. These are common materials, very open to everyday kind of practices. But at the heart of it is really trying to discover how to work on these things. This project, for example, OWO, for me is one of the interesting ones because it shows in a physical prototype the limitations of one individual unit, which is this one which we prototyped, which by itself has the only capacity to curl and to roll, which you'll see in a second. But fundamentally, if it joins with, let's say, two other units, for example, it starts to gain new capacities, new features. What was just a kind of rolling spring-like system could demonstrate itself to actually have legs now, a tripod. It has a capacity of walking. And so these systems we develop at the DRL at the moment, and we've been trying to prototype these things in a way to discover how we can start to expand some of these conversations. So you see the piece rolling here, wirelessly computer controlled, but something like a sidewalk in this animation is a good understanding. The individual unit can't negotiate its boundary, cannot negotiate its found terrain. So collaboration is a necessity for the system to evolve. And so this is the kind of conversations that I think are important in some of the work. And some of those things that we sort of discover sometimes from the very early moments where we ask ourselves, how would two bricks actually collaborate to lift one? How would one have to contract and one have to sort of expand to basically get the basic feature of allowing that thing to climb on top of itself? This idea of collaboration is also something that's very important. It's not just in method, where our students work in self-organizing ways, but it is in practice in terms of how we explore some of these ideas. And you see that sort of playing itself out and basically trying to develop and to write rules that would allow how random states could formalize themselves with ideas of goal generation and how those goals would negotiate themselves based on the number of population and actually what could happen within that world. We don't privilege a tool or a methodology. Basically, anything that works is appropriate in terms of exploring the ideas that we try to do. This is a kind of scenario of, I don't know if you want to call it 500,000 units being deployed within Bedford Square and showing in a certain way, a certain approach of actually what kind of negotiations or what kind of experience that would be like. What would it be like to have an architecture that could change daily? What would it be like for an architecture to have the capacity or the agency to be migratory in its own right? As these kind of questions are unfolding in the DRL, as of the last 5-6 years, within Minimaforms, which has been moving in parallel with all of this stuff with my brother, we've always tried to really think through a certain kind of approach towards communication and interaction. We believe interfacing between things is where intelligence really lies. And we're very much kind of taken by words like enabling as being a fundamental feature of how somebody actually could think through making things more participatory. So it doesn't really matter to us if we're designing an interface for, let's say, a portrait machine, or if we're developing these kind of emotive robotics, if we're designing vehicles, if we're designing basically small maquettes that are demonstrating ideas of more kind of emotive or behavioral features, or if we're looking at materiality, about how we could tailor a kind of architecture and look at soft cast systems and the most available and ready of materials as a strategy for thinking about how architecture could be deployed. The value of actually working through all of these different ideas and all of these different problems is that you realize that there isn't a approach that sort of fits all of the demands of all of these things. And as I go through the 3 projects that I'd like to share with you today, the first one being one that is probably one of the more fundamental ones that me and my brother did very early on. And at the same time, I feel it's probably at the heart of some of the larger motivations that we actually have, which was called a project that we did called Memory Cloud. Originally in Trafalgar Square, we basically asked the question, how could we animate the space through conversation? We were interested. We were building these machines with old CRT screens like I was showing you, and we thought, well, what could it be like to construct an idea of architecture as atmosphere? And we looked fundamentally to that kind of concept of communication as being something that was always quite human. And at the heart of it, one of the oldest forms of communication is smoke signals, like these little cartoons with the plumes of smoke trying to communicate over vast distances using a kind of abstract notational logic. And on the other hand, we were looking at mobile devices, an interface that everybody could use to participate with. So we wanted to create basically space as an interface to rethink the public in a certain form. We got this project when we were pretty young. The ICA basically gave us the opportunity to do it in Trafalgar Square. And the reason for it is we said basically we wanted to animate it through conversation, but we also said Trafalgar Square has always been a space of communication. It's been a place where people celebrate, it's a place where people protest, and at the heart of it, we basically want to create an intervention as an atmosphere that would allow the public to communicate through this form of spatial topography. We did this in 2008, and it got a lot of press, and it had a lot of things. It was called potentially one of the most extreme projects because we allowed people to basically say what they wanted to say, but in a space that was collective with the implications which was very apparent. And that also brought up very different challenges. We worked a year on a project to talk about dissipation rates of basically creating these fog atmospheres in one of the heaviest trafficked areas. We were also at a time of a lot of kind of social unrest in terms of religious respect and all of these other things, and people were worried about riots. What does it mean to bring a large population of people together? Trafalgar Square, in a certain way, had used design to sort of mitigate that. The large pools that were designed to foster renovation and so forth. We were given the okay by the Greater London Authority, and we were given the okay to demonstrate the piece. And of course, there were moments of novelty of people projecting different sort of thoughts on themselves and the thing. There were also a lot of wedding proposals and a lot of other kind of stuff that people felt the need to express in a certain way. We left the project for 2 years. We purposefully didn't take any opportunities to show that again until we were contacted by the city of Detroit and a woman from the Detroit Institute of Arts who invited us actually not to show this project but to come and have a conversation. And over the period of 2 years, we were working to develop a different proposal, which was more for a light railway that was supposed to be down Woodward Avenue. But 2 years into it, Rebecca had asked us if we would be open to do Memory Cloud as a way to introduce ourselves to the community, because there was also this conversation why international artists or architects, whatever you want to call us, were being invited to actually do this when there's so many artists. Actually, all we really wanted to do was to create a framework to have a certain conversation. And when we described our intentions over the years, people also understand that it was motivated by actually having this kind of conversation, which is not very easy, and in a space which would allow people to reintroduce themselves. The Detroit Institute of Arts, the main entrance, the grand entry is always locked. That grand staircase is not necessarily really used. But all of the art community, all of the things like the MOCA, all of these other things, sorry, ICA, Detroit, and all of these other places were holding workshops to talk about, communicating haiku workshops with young children. There was a kind of spirited effort to actually allow people to have that opportunity. The kinds of things that people said was a kind of collective diary. For 3 days, they basically wrote the space of the DIA. And the things that they spoke about, they told me the city was dead, instead it brought me to life. On October 14th, 2006, for an hour, Adams Street and its slab of pavement became the happiest place on earth, and it was unforgettable. I thought I would move back to live among the dead memories of my childhood. I'm more alive than I've ever been. These things is a bit of poetry, a kind of collective and shared way of thinking about how everybody participating in this used it as an opportunity to speak to the city, as if the city would be in a position to listen. And opportunities like this on a Saturday and Sunday night, which the DIA is actually technically closed, to have people gather and to share those kind of experiences with each other was actually very meaningful. Now you could say I'm the artist of the project, so maybe that's all I'm basically talking about. If you're interested, there is something called Voice of Detroit, which you could have a look at some of the testimonies that people shared. But we got an email about 8 months after that some people had come together to talk about actually creating a light and art festival, to use the city as a canvas to be able to communicate with people and to invite artists to use that canvas. They called it the Electricity. And I can say that this biennial has been happening for 2 years since then. And it's actually the proudest thing that me and my brother have actually achieved, I think, because at a certain moment in time, you can make the argument that 2.5 hours over 3 nights had the capacity for people to see themselves and their city differently. And you see that by the kinds of crowds and the different spaces that open themselves up and allow artists actually to instrumentalize the city and allow the community actually to come together before that. The DIA not just being the center point of Woodward Avenue anymore, but still an active participant. After Memory Cloud, we've worked on other kinds of architectural projects. We've been working basically on a national park in Athens. We've been trying to develop basically a piece of land art in Norway. At the same time of working on these more architectural, larger scale kind of initiatives, we used the time in between, let's say, some layovers in the project to develop a research with my colleagues on emotive robotics. So a lot of the work that you see in the DRL of self-assembly and these robots, we needed time to really develop kind of ideas of what that really is. And Petting Zoo was a project that enabled a lot of those conversations. And so with colleagues like Manu and Apo, with my brother, with a history, I think, of understanding cybernetics. Gordon Pask was mentioned today, Walter Gray Walter, Edward Anatovich, the Architecture Machine Group. We tried to revisit some of those ideas of actually trying to make these models of interaction, these ideas of thinking about cybernetic principles of communication and feedback, particularly past concepts of conversation. I actually do believe that conversation is by far the most radical idea of interaction or communication. Sorry, I launched into this stuff and I need a little drink. And so the project itself became this idea, well, how could we make things emotive? How could we actually, not like in projects like Memory Cloud, which you contribute a text, or FaceBreeder, which you contribute a portrait, allow this just to be a kind of engagement between people and machines? And how could those machines exhibit lifelike characteristics, and how could they actually start to communicate in different forms? The project was originally shown at the FRAC, and it's been shown at the Barbican and Onassis Cultural Centre. Every time we install this thing, it gives us an opportunity to see how people really engage with things, how the things actually also see people, beyond using blob detection and skeletal control and developing sort of behaviors like this. Is also trying to evolve a different kind of attitude. Developing a strategy like this, which basically says through illumination, through kinetics, and through sound, these are 3 sort of variables that we could sort of communicate and exhibit a whole series of different kinds of behavioral responses. We were unable to sort of develop a project like this because in the beginning, Connect had been released, but nobody had access to the libraries. And when the libraries were actually sort of given over, it was an opportunity to actually start to think about how we could use these things. What does it mean to construct something that has its own capacity to see? How would it see in a meaningful way and construct a relationship that would allow it to be reactive and transformative in its way? This isn't a space of modeling. This is a real-time environment. This is about how one thing communicates to something else, and it's not about signal and response or feedback in a very straightforward way, but this is about trying to find this balance where difference is meaningful. And the challenges of that is not necessarily just in simulation or visualization, but it's also in terms of developing hardware, and it's also in terms of developing systems that have that kind of capacity where time is really the fundamental medium that you're working with. And this response to time, I think, is what enables, a very different kind of capacity to engage and to respond to the things that you're looking at. So Petting Zoo was developed in that kind of way, and over 3 years we were sort of looking at that. And actually it was installed in many ways in different venues, as I said, but also then the press started to project. And I think one of the things that we're also very interested in, particularly with my brother, is to see how people try to construct understandings and readings of what it is that you do. So the New York Times wrote a very nice piece about the show Digital Revolution at the Barbican, and they showcased the Petting Zoo as being, let's say, the image that they sort of communicated as being one of these kind of robotic projects that is actually not looking at production or industrialization. Wired decided to write, I think it was about 4 articles on the project, each one taking a really different spin based on which issue it was being published and in which place. And so, for example, a bizarre petting zoo where robots replace animals was one of the taglines. And it gets a little bit weirder. The London Metro, which is kind of like our tabloid news, every day taking the tube, started to talk about this thing as some kind of tentacle, I'm not going to use the word because it may have some bad connotation here, monster that's been let loose in London, this kind of playful thing. But maybe the most telling was a 3-hour interview that I had with a Russian broadcasting station. And as I play this, I'll explain the story because I thought that was pretty clear after so many hours trying to explain every detail of this project, which I had never really even explained to myself in this way. If you speak Russian, that's great, but if you don't, like I don't, I asked my student, Sergey, if he would translate this, because this is the 3rd most watched Russian TV, primetime news, and they made a 3.5-minute piece, which is a pretty long piece on something. What she's basically saying is that, let me tell you the story about Theo and Stephen, who moved to London. But over 15 years, they've never been to the zoo. So they decided that they should actually create their own zoo. Theo and Stephen don't believe that animals should be in cages. So they think that robots should be in cages instead. The pets, the part that got me a little bit weird, there was something like proletariat, capitalist, and something about Marxism. That was the signal to ask Sergey to basically ask me, to tell me basically what was going on. She basically translated that if you play nice with the pets play nice with you. But if you don't, then they get angry and they turn red and they, slap you around. She finished the article, or the news broadcast, by basically saying this. She says, I hope, and maybe I don't know if it plays till the end of this, but I hope in the future architects like Theo and Stephen will not only just make robotic animals, but will make robotic humans too. Except her critique of the pet, which she took one of the tentacles walking down Bedford Square, as she was saying this, was, I hope in the future they're a little bit softer than these. So this looks like a serious interview, but this is basically what's being said in the background. And no matter what I want to say about the piece, it really doesn't matter. And I think that that's actually something pretty interesting as well. I'm not interested, and neither is my brother, or a lot of people in my community, about telling people what they should feel or how to experience things. We're trying to design instruments to enable people to be curious, to be exploratory. And I think that that's an important thing, because in itself, there's a moment of self-discovery and understanding, which I think is very meaningful. I'm glad that I sort of segued into that, because, yeah, it was a little bit of a shock. The last project that I want to show you, and I thought I was going to be speaking for a lot longer, but I've kind of been blasting through this, is a project that we recently developed last year for Nesta. Nesta is the innovation department of the UK, and they put together an event which they call Future Fest. And Future Fest is the opportunity that they've set up to invite certain people to speak about the future of money, the future of democracy, the future of machines. And in that context, we were asked, I guess because of projects like Petting Zoo and some of the other stuff that we were doing, if we would speak about the future of machines and design an installation that would allow visitors the opportunity to sort of explore some of that stuff. And so, for example, Vivienne Westwood was talking about the future of ecology. Snowden was talking about, not literally there, but talking about the future of democracy. There were like some very serious players in this conversation. And to be honest, we felt that a lot of the ideas of machines and learning and interfacing and all of these things were sort of being brought into a conversation which was very invisible. And it kind of reminded me when me and my brother first started, especially when the digital, particularly in new media, was moving so strongly away from screen-based interactions. That's part of our kind of upbringing, was to move into space. We've seen the complete reversal of that. And that invisibility, I think, is also something that has for me anyway, challenged this whole idea of space as a real powerful form of kind of collective and shared interaction. And so we spoke about developing a concept which we said, okay, we're going to explore the future of machines through the notion of looking at machines from an architectural and infrastructural perspective. And we discussed developing a project called Emotive City. And part of the argument that we had for the project was that this is 1918 scientific America. There was always the desire or the promise that the city that we would inhabit would be this three-dimensional interface of interconnected buildings, of interconnected machines. An idea that there was this kind of larger ecology that would be operated through and negotiated from. If that was 1918, this was 3 years ago. This is the Transport Authority in London asking 4 or 5 artists, commissioning 4 or 5 artists to paint a picture about a visualization of what the future of London would be. And if you've been to London, you'll recognize that there's a wheel and the gherkin and all of these things. But this was what 2026 would look like. London is strangely familiar with the idea that entertainment and these ideas of horizontal wheels in the air and roller coasters would be actually the new and improved London. That somehow that these things would actually be what people need in the city or desire, or actually would somehow upgrade a very positive vision about what that future would be like. If this is the good, I don't know what you would call this, but I call it shit. This is basically what the world is becoming, where things are not context aware. I'm not basically saying that things have to be somehow preserved in a way that there is no change. No, I'm saying that you have to embrace change and to see how those changes could manifest themselves in the places that they are. This could be anywhere. It is anywhere. It's designed with the idea that is as generic as possible. If before, in the 60s and 70s, no matter if there were hardships, there was a promise for a future, future right now seems like a very retrograde kind of term. You wouldn't say future today. You don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. You just talk about today. And so, looking at that, it was never a question about vision. So for example, Kenzo Tange was basically put as a challenge, 8 million people design a city in Tokyo Bay. This wasn't a speculative project, this was a project. But what was a real problem of this? And this is where I think computation becomes partly part of the solution. How do you deal with uncertainty and change? How do you deal with the fact that there never has been a fully realized master plan or blueprint? How do you allow time, which is really the most adaptive of all system features, to really allow itself to allow things to change? So we looked at it from that perspective, and at the same time we were looking at some of our contemporaries and seeing what their role was. Because at some level, the idea of city is not obviously new, or urbanism is not new. This is Rem Koolhaas's response to his idea of what a smart city would be. He thinks it's going to be dumb. If you paint the world in a really black and white way, potentially because you don't understand that it's going to happen, but what influence do you actually have in terms of meaningfully make that be something more than what is just the bottom line, then you're going to get into conversations like just saying a smart city would be dumb. When you see the people that are really sort of propagating a lot of these ideas, they also propagate a lot of concerns. Why? Why would Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Hawking talk about AI in such a dark way? Because the tendency at the moment is only to see it in that way. To explore the ideas of how this potential and capacity could actually evolve, I think is something that we purposefully and actively have to work on. We can assume this kind of passive observation. I got my time card, I got 5 minutes. But at the same time, I also think we have to have a certain recognition of what is the state of affairs. This is DARPA's Olympics. This is a year ago. This is basically military robots trying to do very basic tasks that you do. If you're really worried about the hostile takeover, it's not happening anytime soon. at least not in the physical world. But if we allow ourselves this kind of invisible world where consequences are not really understood, this is basically what we're lending ourselves to. There's a lot of millions and millions of dollars worth of giggles in this. UK launched basically the first autonomous cars. This is a reality that's happened. And I think in a certain way, it's not a Google project. Every car company is doing this. Volvo is talking about fleets of autonomous ship delivery systems. Minimaforms just moved their sort of place into a place called Somerset House, and we had a launch yesterday, which the London mayor came to. And we showed this project, The Motive City, which at the heart of it was basically talking about what would it be like if our city, existing cities would have a self-organizing ability to have mobility machines within that. We basically made the argument that we must participate and engage in these information-rich environments, and that models of the past can operate as blueprints for our future. When science fiction has become fact, architecture today has to move beyond representation, beyond the fixed and finite tendencies that declare what architecture should be and work towards what it could be. And I show you just this video as a closing, which is basically making the argument that if every individual home was a reflection of the people that were inhabiting it, if like an instrument, each particular house would allow itself to exhibit the features of the residents which are living within it, if they could be mobile, if we could allow this kind of system to really operate within an existing city in the same way that we talk about cars, autonomous cars, and other features, could we allow a different kind of concept of self-organization, one based on social interaction, not basically pricing out people from particular things? What would be emerging qualities of a totally participatory strategy? You may choose to be more nomadic, or you may choose not to be, but the system would have to negotiate, and the system actually would be all of us. So we asked, what if our living environments could inform, could transform and adapt with us? If they do sort of embody, like they really do, all the interiors of our houses are customized with a certain kind of expression of how we want to live and the things that are important to us. If those could manifest themselves in a way to challenge some of the problems that we have in the city, like for example, infrastructures that can't cope with things, in a city like Detroit, which is a shrinking city, something completely other. When we have cities that have a whole series of criteria, flood problems, the idea of fixity in architecture could be questioned, and it's not about science fiction, it is a reality of things. So if we could move towards a self-organized city that would be enabled through machines, through robotics, what would be the consequences of that? It was more asking a question than it was about proposing things. I'm not saying that you should live in little spheres. But we did think about this thing as a kind of self-calculating system. And we tried to develop the installation with these phototropic robots that were symbolic in terms of interactions. And we tied their behavior and their sensitivity to social networks and the TFL, so live streams would have that influence. Robots would interact with other robots, and you could intervene in the system with your iPhone in terms of negotiating basically how that stuff would actually work. The idea is that architecture could get bored, that could challenge you. Idea is that self-assembly and thinking about how this idea of mobility would ask fundamentally how we would like to live in a city. We use reaction diffusion for people that like that kind of stuff, to evolve different kinds of taxonomies, and also to think about how those things could be manifold and expressed. So how could we actually develop strategies that would allow people to communicate through architecture and actually express certain aspects of themselves and how they want to share that with others. So in closing, that's all I really have to say. I thank you for your attention, and I hope it was of interest. Thanks. Do you want questions, or I could take questions if you want, or afterwards? If you have, yeah.
Two questions if folks have questions.
And if not, I'm here till Sunday, so you could catch me somewhere and feel free to ask. Any questions? Or I totally killed everybody with 45 minutes of just monotone voice. Please. Sure.
Historical, it's that Olain was joking because the sentence everything is architecture was of the Corbusier 50 years ago before, but Olain never told and he became famous with this sentence.
Yeah, I mean, the reality of his famous or not famous, I mean, it was a magazine bow that he basically put together. For me, it's more about what does it actually constitute? This idea that everything could be architecture, what does it mean? I basically see, and my brother sees, space as really a medium. And that allows us to think about architecture as being a way to interrogate ideas. And so whatever Hollein was doing is what Hollein did. And honestly, it was a provocation to a lot of people that maybe didn't know the history of that. At the same time, to be honest with you, we could say that the generation of a lot of the students today don't know who Hollein is either. So, or Architecture Machine Group, or maybe Negroponte is just a guy who's just trying to sell some laptops. I think the demand or the accountability, or at least I feel responsibility, is at least to any moment that I have, at least sort of share some references that may be of value to maybe some students that are in the audience. So that's my only moment of accountability here. Any last question? Something super pressing? Yes. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting question. You want me to really work hard in this final couple of seconds. I think it's a foregone conclusion that technology has its own desires, as Kevin Kelly says, in the state of how we see things. But I think that actually sometimes the hard truth about it is that we treat machines and things sometimes better than we do people. And I think it's an obligation to basically find humanity in certain forms and to try to exhibit that in a way that reintroduces, I think, how architecture, space, and urbanism, the idea of the public, is something that is really important today, more so than ever. So as everything is kind of very information rich, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's being used in very smart ways. So maybe Koolhaas is right that smart cities would be dumb. But actually, if that's the case, then so is every other aspect. And if we look at our political arenas, if we look at how we treat each other, I think all of the progress that we've seen in the last 20 years can very easily slip away if we don't actively participate. So I basically believe that architects should participate because they're generally very optimistic people, maybe naive, and maybe the world needs some of that. That's my close. Thanks.